welcome back, everyone. We really appreciate the first panel that we had, which was fantastic, and we appreciate you sharing your lunchtime with us for this part of the agenda, which we're very excited to continue on with the conversations we've been having on media coverage. I'm delighted to have this lunchtime keynote conversation with Ayman Mohyeldin, who is the host of Ayman on MSNBC. Someone who I really wanted to speak to in this moment because of the unique experience that he has, both covering Gaza on the ground during times of war, and also, of course, doing so from the anchor's chair in New York. And so has I think, unique perspective in this moment. And I'm really interested to talk to him about his thoughts and have a number of questions that I want to hear your thoughts on, Ayman. And we're going to try to get to some questions from the audience as well. And you could send those in the same way that you did before with note cards, or for those who are watching online with us for this session, email them in to events@arabcenterdc.org. So, Ayman, to get started, as I said, you have a unique personal perspective here. I remember very well in 2008, 2009, during that Israeli war on Gaza. There were very few Western journalists on the ground. I think, in fact, you and Shireen for Al Jazeera English may have been the only Western journalists on the ground. And in those days, because of the sort of media blackout that was being imposed on the Strip, one of the only ways that I was getting information about what was happening on the ground during that war was from this newfangled social media thing called Twitter.
Right.
And we started to see periodic updates come from you and Shireen. And many people think about Twitter and these kind of massive global events, and sort of the first one as being the revolution in Iran in 2009 and the role that social media began to play then. But actually, it was during that war in Gaza that I think we first began to see the impact of social media. In 2014, you were on the ground again, this time for NBC. And perhaps one of the most searing moments in that war was the killing of the Becker boys on the beach. And of course, you were very close to that incident and up next to those boys shortly before they were killed. So I'm just interested first in sort of your general reactions, having that perspective, both as having covered these situations on the ground and also being in the anchor's chair as you are covering these issues today, and also having that perspective over time. How are you seeing things in this moment?
I think that there are a few layers to it. And you mentioned on a kind of professional side, I'll deal with that kind of first, which is as a reporter, as a news host, and now as a opinion host. And I think sometimes that's a little bit lost in the discussion, because I think in each one of those, the capacity and responsibilities and obligations are different. When you're a reporter, you're documenting what you're seeing. When you're a host or a news host, you have a different responsibility. And certainly when you're an opinion host, which is where I am now, I can give my opinion and my perspective on things as I see it based on my experience. Each one of those occupies a different set of criteria. So I think right now I approach the media landscape and I look at the coverage out of Gaza through those different prisms. So when I'm looking at the media, I look at what are individual reporters doing, what are the on-the-ground journalists, or as close as they can get to it, doing, what are the news hosts doing, and what is the opinion that is being shared? How is all of this information being distilled in a way that individual opinion writers, opinion hosts, thought leaders are sharing the discussion? And I think, as many people have been pointing out, it's been very disappointing on so many of these levels. You know, we can spend hours talking about each one, but as all of the previous panelists eloquently said, there's so many fundamental problems. You'd have to kind of narrow or zero in on a specific part of the conversation to try to understand why is that happening, because each set of those layers has its own challenges, problems structurally, you know, bias problems, resource problems, lack of representation problems. All of those factor at different levels in different ways. So that's kind of like my first assessment on the professional side of it. I think it's safe to say that there's been a disappointment. There's been moments of exceptional journalism that have come out of this war, but also there has been a lot of overall disappointment with where the conversation is collectively, what it's been focused on, how easily it gets distracted, why that happens. On a personal level, it's been extremely difficult. Some of the videos that you've been talking about, I lost several of my friends from Gaza. I actually lived in Gaza for 2 years, so I wasn't just parachuted into Gaza. You know, a lot of people do that, and it's not a critique, it's just the reality of it. But I first went to Gaza in 2005 to cover disengagement, and then ended up going back to live and be the Gaza correspondent from 2008 till 2010, and then have been going back almost every year up until, unfortunately, the last time I was there was about 2018, maybe 2018, 2019. So on a personal level, it's extremely difficult. I know a lot of the journalists that have been killed. I know a lot of the places that have been destroyed. I know a lot of the history of Gaza and the places and the sentiment and the emotions and the resilience of the people that has been shattered as a result of this war.
I wanted to ask you about that and specifically also about Shireen, and you know whose memory we are hosting this symposium today. I imagined that there were going to be many people in that video montage who were killed that you probably interacted with. I wanted to ask you about any of your sort of personal reactions when you heard about Shireen's killing, and also being, you know, a journalist who's worked in these spaces and one who is of an Arab-Palestinian background, and who's also covered, you know, journalists who have been killed, arrested, imprisoned in war zones around the world. What goes through your mind when you sort of see the lack of accountability in cases like Shireen's, in the cases of so many of these journalists who are never going to get the kind of attention that Shireen gets? How do you process that when that could be you in those very war zones covering those things?
The short answer is it's disheartening. It's disheartening and it's disappointing. I first met Shireen in 2005 when I went to go cover disengagement. At the time, I was just a producer at CNN, but I was already looking up to her and another amazing correspondent, Javad Abouderi, who also worked for Al Jazeera. And watching them operate at the time was extremely inspiring. And at the time, I didn't know that in a couple of years I would actually become their colleague, because I left CNN and ultimately went to go work for Al Jazeera English, based in Jerusalem, and got to know them and the entire staff and all the correspondents there extremely well, and the producers. And in so many ways, you know, working with her was like incredible. It was like very inspirational. It was also very just illuminating, because they have such a granular knowledge of the story. And for me, as somebody who is Palestinian American and Arab American, you know, I knew about the conflict. I had lived a little bit of the conflict, but to come back to cover it and to be fully immersed in it, I realized that my own knowledge was extremely deficient. So being able to learn from people who lived it day in and day out not only shapes your coverage as a reporter, but certainly just kind of changes your entire outlook on the conflict and the ability to report it, which I think is something that has stayed with me. So if there's like any aspect of, you know, honor that I can kind of give somebody like Shireen, is that what she has taught me has stayed with me throughout my career as a journalist and being able to report. And we heard earlier today from Senator Van Hollen about how she, you know, may not be able to change anything, but ultimately wanted to be a voice for the voiceless. And I think that's kind of stayed with me in all the stories that I've covered, whether it is in Gaza, the West Bank, Iraq, and even Ukraine in some parts. But I think that anytime you're a journalist who risks your life for a story, you kind of ask yourself a very fundamental question, which is, do you believe that what you are committed to is something you're willing to risk your life for? And I think that journalists kind of go through these questions at some point in their career and they say, you know, am I prepared to lose my life for what I am doing? And if you believe in it, you do it. And you probably revisit that question in milestones in your life, like when you start a family or when you have children and you start to reevaluate, is it still worth it? Is it still contributing to a greater good when you're witnessing what is happening now? And having put myself in those situations before, I can tell you that journalists do not run into danger for the sake of thrill and an excitement. So it was very clear early on that when you kind of saw the narrative that was coming out about Shireen, that it followed a playbook that we've seen so many times when it comes to Palestinian journalists, which is to try to dehumanize them, discredit them, delegitimize them. If it's not them, it's their employer. If it's not their employer, it's their funders. If it's not their funders, it's their platform. If it's not that, it's how they did it, it's why they did it, you know? So for me, it was extremely painful. I remember that day very well, waking up to a barrage of text messages and phone calls from friends overseas, many of them in the bureau in Ramallah, and just completely in utter shock. I think like I couldn't move for several hours. I didn't even know how to process the information, you know? And it would be really genuinely a couple of days before I can even begin to wrap my head around it. Coincidentally, that night I was guest hosting, I think, on a colleague of mine's show, Chris Hayes, and I ended up doing like a big monologue in tribute to Shireen, who, you know, most people didn't know was Palestinian American, I think. And again, it shows you a little bit of the double standards that exist in our profession, in our industry, and how news organizations and news advocacy organizations selectively choose how they champion the cause of certain journalists, how they get behind them, how they champion them, how they advocate for their freedom, and how others can be brushed aside or marginalized in how we remember them. And I think it's important that, you know, we are all here in her memory to make sure that that does not happen to, I think, one of the greatest generational journalists of our time.
You talked a little about some of the repeating narratives that we see, and this is something that I want to ask you about. I mean, unfortunately, episodes of wars on Gaza have become all too common. We've seen them in 2008-9, 2012, 2014, 2020, again now, in this most catastrophic fashion. And very often there are common narratives that just keep replaying around these episodes in the media discourse. Having sort of had the perspective that you had in covering these different moments over time, how do you think things have evolved? How does this moment's media discourse perhaps differ from the moments that we've seen in previous coverage of such episodes?
So there's a few ways. Some of it is kind of, I would say, purely just, I don't know if the right word is superficially, but kind of just from a landscape. You have more media outlets, you have social media, you have the internet, you have independent journalism, you have citizen journalism. So that in of itself has changed the dynamic. I mean, in 2008, we had cell phones, but barely, I mean, it was very grainy cell phones. Nobody was like broadcasting live, nobody was streaming live. You couldn't see these things almost in real time as much as you could. We'd still have to go out. My colleague Shireen did some amazing reporting during the war in 2008 where you'd go out, gather all the elements, come back, broadcast it, feed it out to the world. So there was always that time delay. Now we are literally seeing these strikes live streamed on our phones in between, you know, the routine of our daily lives, which is quite shocking because in real time we are learning how to process this, but we're also desensitizing ourselves to this in real time, where the shock of a moment that would happen was maybe once a day, or like when the story came out, you would see it and you would be shocked and you'd be horrified by it. I think through the course of any day throughout this war, probably being shocked 20 times, and you're being shocked and horrified 20 times while you're still trying to go about doing your daily business. And I'm just thinking it is taking a psychological toll on us that I don't think we're going to realize for some time, you know? It's also different in the narratives that have emerged, but it's remarkably the same. If you go back to 2008, you will see a lot of the reporting is very much the same. Shifa Hospital was a command and control center for Hamas back then in 2008. You know, human shields. The narratives that we're hearing now about the Palestinians in Gaza, the tunnels, you know, was just emerging as a talking point. That has now become like a full-blown thing. So I think in so many ways, the narrative from one side has been the same in terms of how to describe the war. And I think on the other side, you know, from a Palestinian perspective, the suffering has been exacerbated, and we've kind of lost a little bit of the fact that Gaza has been blockaded for close to 17, 18 years now, since 2006, 2007. So when you really kind of think about it, so much has changed, but not a lot has changed. And we have a generation of journalists, I think, who are covering this story, who, again, I remember in 2008, 2009, one of the talking points is, we left Gaza. Gaza could have been the Singapore of the Middle East. And we hear those same talking points now, but nobody's stopping to ask, well, why didn't it become the Singapore of the Middle East? You know? So in some ways, parts of the story have not changed, have not evolved. The discourse has not changed. Some of the same people are still on the air as they were back then, and you know, I think there's a lot of discussion to be had around that as a separate subject, but fundamentally, I think we're still dealing with the core issues, and the core issues never get really discussed in a true fashion. We always kind of stay very skin deep or superficial. We don't ever try to go beyond that. And it's something I've tried to do, is try to kind of go to the root issues of the problem and the context behind it, which I think is not something we generally do very well.
You know, you talked about some of the technological differences, right, between 2008 and today, especially the speed with which images and realities are being represented out into the world. Do you see that sort of, particularly the social media dimension, has had a sort of corrective impact on mainstream media reporting of this issue?
Yeah, in overall, I would say yes, but it's also posed a very difficult challenge because we see a lot of fake news and a lot of manipulated news that gets pushed around on social media. Sound bites get manipulated, videos get manipulated, and they go viral. And I think, again, I think earlier you guys were talking about the 40 beheaded babies. That's a really good example of how something happened on social media and took off and became a viral moment that has defined a huge part of this war. That started with a social media clip where a reporter on the scene posted on social media the video of, I believe it was a woman who said, I just spoke to an Israeli officer or Israeli spokesperson, military spokesperson, who told me he saw 40 beheaded babies. And it took off. That is one component of it. The other component of it is, because we are also able to see real time into what is happening on the ground inside Gaza, the ability to spin it and package it and dilute it becomes much harder. So we're able to see that in real time. So the short answer is technology has profoundly changed the landscape of the media for overall good, but with serious concerns of negative aspects as well that we should be mindful of.
I want to ask you about an opinion poll that I saw recently that kind of shocked me. Perhaps it shouldn't have shocked me. But I was really blown away from this. So Pew Research did some polling back in February, and by that point, well over 25,000 Palestinians, perhaps closer to 30 by that point, had been killed during the war. And of course, somewhere closer to 11 or 1,200 Israelis were killed on or just after October 7th. And the poll found that 50% of Americans could not identify whether more Palestinians or more Israelis had been killed during the war. The ratio was something like 26 to 1 at that time. but 50% of Americans didn't know. And, this, of course, is perhaps outside of, everything happening with Donald Trump, right? Been the lead story in the news for the last 7 months. Working in an industry whose role it is to inform the American public, how do you react to that extent of, I guess, misunderstanding? And how do you explain it?
I think, it's very disappointing, but I think that ultimately, if you kind of look at the other aspects of polls, confidence in media has been going down gradually for years. I think people are losing confidence and trust in media. There are a lot of valid reasons for that, and there are a lot of unfortunate reasons for that. Some self-inflicted, but also the attack on media generally. And this is not to excuse any of it, but when you have politicians and others constantly disparaging the media as the enemy of the people, then you're going to get people wanting to distance themselves from it. And we're seeing this even across many institutions, whether it's Congress, Supreme Court, media, what have you, financial institutions. So there is an erosion that is happening in the kind of like social contract or the social trust between media and consumers. The other aspect of it, or viewers or readers or audience members, listeners, the other aspect of it is, and again, I think it's self-evident. Part of it is the way the media has covered this conflict has not been good. And so as a result, the people who are consuming the media, listening, watching, reading, are ill-informed about it. That's just a reality. Media literacy is a huge component of this equation. I don't think we do a good job as consumers of media to learn how to read the media. And I use the word read not in the kind of traditional sense of reading a newspaper, but I do think that media literacy and people understanding the different aspects of journalism, media, social media is extremely important, because people think that they're getting information that is reliable, or people think that they're getting information from a news source, but it's not really a news source. It's just a guy with a microphone and a podcast or somebody who's streaming. So it's we're in a transformative period of information where information is ubiquitous, knowledge is not. Everybody has access to information on their fingertips, but I don't think everyone is going to spend time in trying to understand or delve into the events that are taking place. And so you will, again, end up with a very surface or skin level deep awareness of the story, just the headlines, and the ones that you follow. If you think you follow certain people because you like their worldview, you end up getting that worldview across the board on every aspect, whether it's climate change, politics, the Me Too movement, or the war in Gaza.
Right. News you can choose.
Yeah, you choose. People are looking, I think, for more and more affirmation than information. Mm-hmm. I want to be affirmed. And so I go onto social media and I follow the people that I want to follow that are going to give me the stories that I want to hear. And so as a result of that, you're going to get the diluted version of the reality, whether it's one way or the other, not on just Israel, Gaza, but on anything to do with stories that are polarized or have opposite sides.
I have a couple more questions for you, but I do want to let our audience know that if you have questions, you can write them down on your note cards and you can send them up at this time. And also for those watching online, send them into events@arabcenterdc.org. I saw a segment the other day on the news that I wanted to sort of get your opinion on. There was this coverage of the protests that have been going on campus. And the anchor said something to the effect of, these protesters, don't they know that the time that I'm spending covering them is time that I could be spending covering what's happening in Gaza? And I wonder, what is your perspective on that? And is that how sort of coverage priorities are done behind the scenes?
I can't give away the secrets behind the scenes. You know, the interesting aspect of it is that, well, if you are a host of a show that bears your name, you do have the ability to prioritize what you want to put on that show. So if you feel something is getting undue attention, you can give it more attention. If you feel something is getting too much attention, you can say, hey, we're not going to try to spend a lot of time on that, even though people may think it's important or maybe the thing that's trending. So it is, I saw those comments. It's not how I personally approach the show. I don't think that really makes a lot of sense. You know, there are millions of things that are happening every day in the world. We see stuff happening in Africa every day and we choose not to cover it. It's a choice. And the reasons why you make those choices are a variety of reasons. They're not sinister. Some of them are just genuinely editorial decisions. You have 50 minutes in a show. You have to prioritize what you think are the most important stories that your audience is coming to you for, whether it's politics or conflict or business or whatever. So ultimately, you're making those editorial decisions. I don't think we just simply say, hey, these protests are taking place, let's just cover it. And again, there are ways to cover it with a little bit of a balance and not just kind of be hyperbolic and hyperventilating about it.
So
I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, I think it does. I want to give one question that comes from our audience, which is similar to a question that I was going to ask you as well. What are the battles worth fighting for in the editorial room? Are there battles worth letting go in order to avoid backlash or cancellation, and you know, at the platform to work in American media? How do you know the difference?
Well, that's a great question. Who said that?
This comes from Ahmed Daman at NPR.
Oh, okay, of course. So it's a really good question. I think I would probably say, and we would all disagree about it in this room, but I think you'd have to kind of evaluate what you think is a central tenet to the ability to understand the conflict and to the viewpoint that is being espoused. So, you know, again, the arguments that I would make as a journalist are very different than the arguments that I would make now as a opinion host. And again, I make that distinction because there is a big difference between having the platform to share your opinion and being a reporter and trying to get your bosses and your editors to say, this is what I am seeing, and I'm telling you, this is the reality. So when you are a journalist, or again, when you're a reporter or perhaps a news host, your sense of obligation to your viewer is a little bit different. You want to try to maintain objectivity, impartiality. You want to follow the facts. It's not simply about both sides. You don't just simply say, person X says A, person B says Y, and you end up with 2 minutes of nonsense in your report. You want to be able to distill and kind of test those points. So the short answer to it is I would probably say, take a step back for a minute and say, is this a cosmetic issue to fight? I'm not going to kind of relitigate the conversation that we're having. They're very valid points. But there is a lot of debate as to whether it should be called the Israel-Gaza war, the Israel-Hamas war, Israel-Palestine war, the standards of why certain language is used. Those are all very valid conversations to be had. But there are also a lot of challenges and things that they open the door to. And so you have to ask yourself, okay, if we are now going to start having a conversation around terminology, is that a battle you want to fight every single day, or is it something that you realize the banner is something that is written by somebody in a completely different department? If you want to sit there and fight it and go through those channels to change, certainly worth a valid fight or pursue. Or do you want to focus on the substance of what it is that you're going to be able to say on your show and the guests that you're going to bring and the presentation that you're going to bring? What do you think the viewers are going to be more concerned with in that discussion? So I think you really have to kind of evaluate it from where you sit in the newsroom as opposed to just a general blanket of like, you have to fight everything, you have to fight all the time. Because the truth is, you need to have more people in the newsroom to fight all of these different battles at the same time. It's just really hard for one person to say, I'm going to take on these 7 different fights at the same time, or these 7 different causes that I want to try to change within a newsroom at any given moment. Yeah.
You've played different roles in the process. You talked about playing a role as a producer, obviously doing reporting, and in the sort of opinion, role. a lot of people will watch on the TV to get information and perhaps don't necessarily understand the nuanced differences between each of these roles, or don't necessarily understand everything that might go into producing what it is that ends up on their screen. What are challenges that you might deal with, specifically with covering this issue, that most people who are watching may not fully appreciate?
Most people who are not watching, or most
Who
people
are watching may not fully appreciate.
the challenges that I personally deal with?
Yeah, in covering this issue.
You know, I think the context and the history. I think there are a lot of different issues that you have a really hard time talking about. I'm trying to think of. There's so many examples that I can give you. I mean, it's like we don't have an honest conversation about a lot of the terminology that is used, and we tend to use a very reductive approach in the way that we have these conversations. I don't think that you see a lot of American media discussing, unless you see a political, as we're seeing right now, legislation that is being passed to discuss Zionism, anti-Semitism in the kind of political sense. So I think it goes back to the other question, which is like you choose your battles about what you want to sit here and kind of discuss. Because what has happened from year upon year is the bar keeps getting, the goalposts for the conversation keep changing. And so what you were able to talk about in 1948 or 1950 or 1960 is very different than what you're talking about now. And you see that when you go back and study how the media in the 1950s and 60s was writing about the end of British colonial rule in the region and the birth of Israel and the Mandate. And the terminology has changed over the years and the goalposts keep changing, that you realize either the space is shrinking or it's being pivoted and changed from one direction to the other. So to your second question about the challenges that I face is, to what degree do you want to refocus the conversation on the more important, broader issues, and to what extent do you just kind of get caught up in the day-to-day aspect of the coverage? So that is the quintessential challenge I think that everyone has, because it goes to the point that you're saying. We are all watching the college protests. Most of the people in here are probably disappointed with the coverage of the college protests in American media. And so the question then becomes is, do I try to course correct that conversation about the college protests? Or do I actually say, they're happening, they're important, but I really want to stay focused on what's happening in Gaza? And those are two important conversations, because if you lose one, you've kind of lost the other. If you're losing the conversation around college campuses and the protests and what they're meant to be, then you've lost the narrative in this country around what the aim of the protests are. And we've seen how they've been we've seen all kinds of politicians, actors, members of the media try to discredit the college protests. So it's a challenge about deciding every week, what do you want to focus your platform on so that you can help whoever's watching this show, whoever is watching you online, to have a better understanding of what is taking place on the issue that you genuinely care about, which is trying to raise awareness and educate people on the conditions in Gaza. So it's that tug of war between prioritizing what you think is important, but also using what is happening as a conduit back into what is important.
I want to kind of ask you a question that it comes from our audience that sort of follows on that note. You talked about some of that coverage of the protests as well as other pieces of everything that's going on. Obviously, within a network and across networks, there's a lot of different takes, perspectives, forms of coverage. How do you reconcile your own beliefs, morals, your own coverage with really strong differences, biases, misinformation on other programs, perhaps including at your own network that have a very different take? Do you have conversations about those things? Is there sort of education that happens between colleagues, heated disagreements? How does that work?
Yeah, I mean, look, ultimately a newsroom is meant to be a place for contending ideas and competing ideas. I think, again, and I can't emphasize this enough, most people don't recognize the difference between the news shows on a network and the perspective shows on a network. So when you are given a platform of being allowed to express your opinion, you don't have to be impartial. You don't have to be objective. You just have to ground your opinion in facts and realities that you can explain to your viewers, and your viewers can watch and say, that's an opinion I like, that's an opinion I don't like, that's an opinion I disagree with, that's an opinion I don't disagree with. That's different than, and it's like in newspapers when you're reading the op-ed section of the paper versus when you're reading the A section. That doesn't mean that there aren't problems, structural problems in the news part. There are a lot of structural problems in the news part. But in the opinion part, you have the ability to have an opinion and expressing it. So a lot of colleagues in cable news have opinions that I don't agree with, and I am sure they don't agree with my opinions either. But we, I think, try to maintain a certain degree of respect, and whenever we can engage in debate and discussion, we try to share those ideas. Whether that translates for the viewers in a change of coverage or a change of opinions, I'm not sure, but it's a work in progress. You know, we try to exchange ideas whenever we can, because a newsroom is ultimately a reflection of all the people that are in it. And so if you have more opinions in it, or if you have more people that represent different backgrounds in it, that's going to get reflected into the output of the journalism.
We're just about at the end of time for this conversation, and unfortunately we're not going to be able to get to all of the different questions that we have. But I did want to ask you to sort of end on this. You talked earlier about the impact that Shireen had on you, what you learned from Shireen and Javara, for example, and I'm sure there were many others along the way who've helped sort of shape the way that you think about doing this job. What advice would you have to younger journalists, or perhaps those who are considering to pursue a career in journalism and are interested in covering this issue? What advice would you give them?
Do it. Do it. I mean, just do it. I mean, it's like, I mean, I know that sounds very simple, but you know, first of all, journalism by its nature is made up of human beings, so it is going to be an imperfect profession, right? There's no science to it. If you do not get involved in the conversation, other people will have the conversation without you. It's not a perfect conversation right now, certainly in this current climate, but you need to encourage people to participate. And the beautiful thing about what we're living through right now with the rise of technology and more platforms is you can be an independent journalist. You can literally, as some of my colleagues have, pursued their own path independently, and can be very, can be rewarded for it with the platform that you're given, that people will come to you to watch you, to hear you, to share your thoughts and ideas. So I do think that for young journalists, I think, one, find your purpose, be committed to something that you like. I think sometimes people come up to me and say, like, I want to do what you do. And I think the more important takeaway is to find out what it is that you want to do, why you want to do it, right? Mm-hmm. My own personal experience growing up between the Middle East and the US shaped my worldview, and it shaped the way that I wanted to cover foreign news. But you don't have to pursue foreign news just because you have a central issue that you want to advance. You can advance the issues that you like, or care about the issues that you like, by also being a sports reporter, by being a local news reporter, by being an editor, by being a photojournalist, by being a documentary filmmaker. There is no one path to success, and there's no one path to storytelling. So I try to tell people to widen their scope, especially when you speak to young journalism students, as I do frequently, that, you know, the idea of conventional media or mainstream media is evolving. And even now within big news corporations, you have digital, and you have social, and you have online, and you have long format, and you have short format, and you have all kinds of different stuff. So there are tremendous opportunities out there, but I think ultimately you have to have a purpose and a drive to do it, and not to shy away from difficult moments. You know, we can easily be discouraged from what we see right now to say, I don't want to be a part of it, and that is fair. But I do also think that there is no progress if more and more people who are passionate about the things that they care about do not get involved in the conversation and say, I'm going to let somebody else deal with that, whether it's politics or journalism. You have to get into the fight if you want to change the outcome of what it is that you're critiquing.
Very well. Thank you, Ayman, very much.
Thank you
for having this conversation with us.